Money for homeless, not for war. This is what we're out here for. Money for housing, not for war. This is what we're out here for. Money for climate, not for war. Right on.
No more warfare in Ukraine! No more warfare in Ukraine!
In quote, Democrats like Barbara Lee, and the fact that every single Democrat in Congress voted for $40 billion for this war in Ukraine is all the more reason why we need to be out there and we need to be opposing this war and opposing their lining up for World War III, because that's what this is about.
Good morning, everybody. We have all come here with a deep and true conviction that we must necessarily work together in order to forge a path forward to a better world. That we must necessarily unite with other people and harness the power that we have in the people to leave a decent, respectable, healthy life for our children, our grandchildren, and all the generations to come. And we must necessarily struggle through our different differences and continue to build the forces of our unity in order to leave that better life for future generations. Now I want to ask you a question. What do you think is that unity that we're struggling here for today? I have a few different answers here, and I think that that's great. I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say to that question throughout this program here today. But I think that we can all agree that one point that we're united around, and one reason why we have all managed to get out of bed and come here and join together this morning, is that we are standing in opposition to U.S. Congress approving $40 billion in the most recent lethal aid package to send to the war in Ukraine. Boo. Boo. And we oppose Barbara Lee's yes vote to this bill. Barbara Lee, who is the U.S. House representative for this district here in Oakland, who voted in lockstep with every single Democrat in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives to unanimously approve this newest aid package for military endeavors in the war in Ukraine. But we're not only just here to talk about what one politician voted for or didn't vote for, because I think that we see the reason why we need to stand strong against all of these billions of dollars going to fund war across the world, is that the $40 billion that was just sent is only going to escalate this conflict to further heights and even towards nuclear war. And so we need to see this as part of a bigger picture that we all have a stake in opposing. And with that, I would like to invite up our first speaker today, Alice from United Against War and Militarism, who's going to speak on the struggle in New York City.
I wanted to share a few remarks just about what it actually means to stand in opposition to this war, and talk a little bit about the situation we're up against, and share a few observations from what we've been doing in New York. So, you know, as Katie said, and as others have noted, the Democrats and the Republicans, although slightly less the Republicans, are pretty united on supporting just endless escalation and total insanity in terms of U.S. foreign policy right now. This includes, obviously, all of the Democrats, including all the token progressives, people like Barbara Lee, but also Ilhan Omar, AOC from over in Queens and New York, and of course Bernie, McGovern en masse, people who many in anti-war circles for years have been saying we are supposed to regard as, quote, our allies and our friends in Congress. But with allies like these, who needs enemies? And I think it actually really goes to show that this isn't just a little misstep, it actually shows what these politicians are fundamentally about. They put forward a little token, kind of almost nothing anti-war position that they know will not actually carry the day, will not actually make it into the NDAA. And then, you know, when the time really comes, they line up behind the party line and they do what's required of them. And I think that we really have to see through this and see that if we're going to have any hope of building any real opposition to this war and to US wars in general, we have to see through these people and not put faith in them. But it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about what they're actually supporting right now. Because of course they're saying, we're supporting democracy in Ukraine, we're for the right of the Ukrainian people to decide their future, all these kind of high-sounding phrases. But the US elite has been clear before the war started and throughout, although they've not said it as loudly as some other things, that they really want to turn this into a quagmire. They want to turn it into something where Russia, is destroyed militarily, economically, by dragging the war out for years and years and years. It's not about standing up for democracy. We see that, as the war has developed, the initial kind of high of the war propaganda has given way to a little bit more objectivity in the US media. They are admitting now, the New York Times and other media sources, that things aren't going so well for the Ukrainians and the Russians are taking more territory and so on. And they're now talking fairly openly about the war possibly dragging on for years, trying to get people to support this, just pour money and arms and everything into this conflict for years and years and years to come, which is, of course, totally crazy and not at all something we should support, because it's really no future at all for the people of Ukraine. It's a disaster what they're living through right now. People are being displaced, refugees in Poland, women are being trafficked sexually and coerced into prostitution. People's whole lives have been upended and destroyed by this. And the actions of the US elite are making it worse in a very clear and measurable way. So even if our basic thing is that we want to support what's best for the people in Ukraine, this ain't it, So I just want to conclude by talking a little bit. We've been told, that we have to line up to support this if we support the people in Ukraine. And in the current environment, making some just basic points about the situation, like that US NATO and NATO expansion in Eastern Europe provoked Russia. Russia said, don't do this, and so on. And then the US did it anyway. That there are far-right and Nazi groups that are part of the Ukrainian armed forces and everything like that. Making these basic points is enough to have you labeled a traitor to the US, to have you be labeled pro-Putin, pro-Russia. It's a pretty crazy environment right now. So we've really got to come together just to cut through that propaganda and put out some basic analysis and facts about what's going on. And I think we've seen firsthand in New York how this has really actually split the anti-war movement, where a lot of people who have a lot of history of standing up against US wars and aggression around the world, including the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the war in Yemen, the US operations in Africa, these people, when it came time to oppose this, suddenly vanished into the background and they were nowhere to be seen, or they didn't want to say anything publicly because they were afraid of criticism from some liberal friends. And I think that's the situation we're up against right now. It's a smaller group of people right now, but we got to be strong. We got to come together. We got to see through these politicians who are trying to just say, stand up behind the US state and escalate to nuclear war if that's what it takes. I mean, it's pretty crazy right now. But we got to be strong. We got to build a movement that can really see that the US ruling class right now has no inclination to do the right thing with this conflict. They want to escalate. They want to do crazy stuff. And we got to stand up to that. We got to build a movement that can really put pressure on them. That's the only way this is really going to change.
And when Alice talks about this war dragging on for years, that's not a hypothetical. I mean, Boris Johnson, just in the past week, has been telling the press that people need to prepare for this conflict to be going on for years. So some of the top leaders in the world right now are really treating that as the serious prospect for our immediate future. Next up, I would like to welcome Eleanor from Code Pink to the mic.
Oh, I was trying to think of what would be a manageable sign to bring today, and this is it. Question. And the reason that I did it is that it's a universal symbol of the fact that we have to question what's going on, and we have to insist on things being different. And we are here today in front of Barbara Lee's office to express our anger and our annoyance and our insistence that she change the way she's voting for appropriations for war. $40 billion, I can barely say that. It's an amount of money I can't even imagine. But $40 billion she voted for continuing a war in Ukraine which has no military solution. That's the important thing for us to understand, that there is no military solution in this war in Ukraine, just as there is no military solution for the war in Yemen, which is now winding down after 7 years. There is no military solution for that. And we need to understand that almost all wars have no military solution. They simply have the benefit for the military-industrial complex, for organizations like Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and somebody I left out. There's 5 of them, and including General Atomics, which makes the drones. The war in Ukraine is a proxy war, and the proxy war is just an extension of long-distance warfare that the United States has engaged in. We went from rifles and guns to drones, airplanes, and now we have proxy wars, and we further distance ourselves from the wars, yet we support them. This war in Ukraine has to end. There is no military solution. I just want to reiterate, just a moment here. I printed this morning, and the print is so tiny. I want to reiterate the 4 things that this coalition today is asking for. One is that there's no more weapons and no more money for weapons in Ukraine. The second is that we want negotiations. We don't want war, we want diplomacy, and we want negotiations. There is no military solution. The third thing is that this is a proxy war with Russia. We are using Ukrainian people as fodder. The more we give money to Ukraine, the more the Ukrainian people will suffer. And lastly, we must say no to nuclear war, and we must say no to NATO expansion. And I'm really glad that all of you are out here today. This is a hard road for us because, as Alice said, and as Katie said, there are so many people who respect Barbara Lee and vote for her without thinking about what she's doing currently. It is a 2-party system in this country. It is hard to challenge it. And we have to start questioning what it is that is going on, and we have to start standing up in opposition to what's going on in Ukraine. And I just want to end by saying that I've talked to a lot of people, including people from Ukraine, about money for the war in Ukraine. I just came back from the Poor People's Campaign, and I talked to a group of Ukrainian women standing on the steps of the Rayburn building in Washington with tears in their eyes, begging for money for the war. It is not the responsibility of the United States to be the police person of the world. Right. Yeah. That is not our job. Our job is to help bring peace and justice worldwide and to make sure there is more equality among people in the world. Our job is not to be the policeman. The money that we're spending on the war in Ukraine is our money. That money should be used for domestic programs. We are about to get rid of this subsidized lunch program, voucher program for children in this country because there's not enough money. But we just voted for, or not we did, but Congress voted for $40 billion for the war in Ukraine. It is our money. We should have a say in how that's used. We need that money for our people. We need that money to keep us safe at home. Anyway, thank you all for coming today, and thank you all for being here and for standing up for what's right.
put away the weed for a little bit and question what's going on, because this is serious. At some point, though, we need to bring out some exclamation points. We need to say no to the war.
No to the war.
No to escalation.
No to escalation.
No to nuclear conflict.
No to nuclear conflict.
And we do need to criticize these politicians for spending our taxpayer dollars on the war, but we know that they are oftentimes just going to vote in lockstep with the interests of the military contractors and the weapons manufacturers, and we are the ones who are going to stop them from doing that ultimately. They're not just going to do it out of the goodness of their own hearts. And now I'm going to call up Aisha from Palestinian Youth Movement.
My name is Aisha Mansour, and I am an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. We are here today to explicitly and unequivocally demand the end to U.S. intervention by financing wars abroad that benefit U.S. imperialist interests only. It goes without saying that the U.S. priorities are not saving the lives of the most marginalized. Just last May, the largest ever military assistance package was approved for Israel at a staggering $38 billion.
$38 billion.
$38 billion to finance occupation and genocide against a people without an army. It is not because the United States cares about the Israelis or Palestinians. It is because Israel serves as a foothold for U.S. domination in the Middle East, and it is in their best interest to financially support them at all cost. This war is no different. The United States does not care about Ukrainian or Russian lives. They care about NATO expansion and economic domination. And millions will die in the proxy war because of these interests. We are here today to force the U.S. government to confront its own global system of murdering lives for the sake of profit. Our lives, our lands, our families, our people are not collateral damage in the quest for capitalist profit. The anti-war movement in the United States has largely been silent on this issue, and it is because of the immense propaganda that we see put out, specifically by the Democrats. Every single Democrat in Congress signed on to this $40 billion aid package to Ukraine. Barbara Lee, who prides herself on her anti-war activism, is now actively supporting U.S. interests in fueling war when it comes to Ukraine. This aid package implies the expectation of a long war. It is not for immediate relief like previous packages have been. And we as Palestinians can't help but notice how this package resembles the $54.5 billion package that was approved in 2003, the very first year of the Iraq War. It was also granted with the expectation of a long war. As we know, rather than allocating taxpayer money into useful programs that could benefit people here with education, housing, or healthcare, the U.S. would rather utilize billions of taxpayer money to fund proxy wars, dictatorships, and military regimes abroad. This is not shocking because the U.S. necessitates war, exploitation, and oppression as an imperialist nation to maintain its world domination. Whether it is in Palestine or the Philippines, the U.S. empire has laid its imperialist body all over the global south, from propping up and supporting neo-colonial rulers and fascist dictators like Duterte, to arming the Zionist occupation forces that demolish our home and steal our land in Palestine and viciously abuse and murder Palestinians with absolute impunity. The support for Ukrainian resistance in mainstream media not only shows where U.S. economic interests lie, but also shows the deep-seated racist nature of this country. We, as Palestinians, have never had our resistance to occupation glorified by Americans. I cannot speak to you all today without acknowledging how infuriating this hypocrisy is. Americans are not questioning supporting resistance coming from Ukrainians, from white Ukrainians, many of whom are in Nazi brigades, while they have denied us basic human dignity for over 100 years. We, the PYM, stand with every single person across the planet fighting for their land and their home. And we demand that this grace be extended to us as well. We must end U.S. intervention, we must end these endless wars, and we must hold our electeds accountable when they support the death of millions for their own economic gain. To do this, we need to revitalize the anti-war movement in the United States. We cannot be shamed into silence any longer. U.S. intervention always leads to more death and destruction. Let me repeat that again. U.S. intervention always leads to more death and destruction. There is never an exception to that fact. Thank you for your time and your principled support for this pressing situation. As Palestinians, we know the U.S. government will never truly support and bring about freedom. We know our power comes from each other, from joint struggle, from people power, and our commitment to push from all angles against imperialism, exploitation, and oppression. So we as all people can take and stand against this war. Free Palestine, free the land, and free the people. Thank you.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
Steve Zeltzer from the United Front Committee for a Labor Party, up to the mic.
I'm with the United Front Committee for a Labor Party. Also, I do a show called Work Week on KPOO, and I'm with Pacifica program, COVID, Race, and Democracy. Is that this war is not just a war in Ukraine, it's a war on working people all over the world, including the United States. The bombs that are falling in Ukraine are paid for by working people here when you have thousands of people homeless in Oakland, when you have people that can't get health care, when they're closing schools in black and brown working class communities because they say they don't have enough money. And this congressperson who calls herself a liberal, a progressive, is voting for 40, 50 billion for the war in Ukraine. That is a crime. That's a crime. When you vote for war bonds for a war. And we have to say she also supports the Zionists. She supports for money for Israel. Now, how is that benefiting the people of Palestine? How is that benefiting the people of the United States? It's an attack on the people of Palestine. So this is the Democratic Party Congress. This is who they stand for. That's a pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist Congress that we have. And that's another reason we need a Labor Party. We need a workers' political alternative in this country, so people have a choice, which they don't have right now. Now, I want to talk a bit about the role of the unions, because there was just an AFL-CIO convention in Philadelphia, and there was also a conference of 4,000 trade unions in Chicago with labor notes. And one of the interesting things about these conferences and AFL-CIO convention, not a word was mentioned about Ukraine. Not one word was mentioned at the AFL-CIO convention about Ukraine. Not one word was mentioned at the Labor Notes conference against Ukraine. Why is that? Why would you say that it's off the table to talk about that? I say that's State Department socialism. You can't talk about defending working people and unions in this country without fighting wars abroad. That's part of the fight for working people in this country, because the money that's going to the war is coming out of the hides of working people in this country. That's who pays for wars, along with the working people in Ukraine, the working people in China, the working people in Russia, all over the world. Now, there's another important factor which we have to bring into this, is that the AFL-CIO leadership has been involved in coups and overthrows. When we talk about coups and counter-revolutions, the United States is an expert in that. We've overthrown over 80 countries around the world, bringing democracy, as they say, to countries around the world, actually bringing controls of multinationals, thugs, and murderers. That's who the United States is involving around the world. So the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the U.S. government, funds the AFL-CIO International Solidarity Committee, quote-unquote Solidarity Committee, in its operations around the world. And the Solidarity Committee was involved in Ukraine in supporting right-wing trade unionists and helping to overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014. Now, what happened in Ukraine? When we talk about democracy, McCain and U.S. capitalist politicians were going to Ukraine urging people to overthrow the government. Does that have something to do about democracy? When we talk about counter-revolution and attack on democracy, not just the U.S. government, but the AFL-CIO was involved in overthrowing the government. Now, why do they want to do that? What's this all about? Do we really want to have democracy in Ukraine? What it's about is privatizing the wealth of Ukraine. What it's about is privatizing the mines and the farms so U.S. investors, U.S. capitalists can take that over. That's what this war is really about. It's an imperialist war about taking over the wealth and resources of Ukraine and also Russia. That's what this real war is about. That's what all war is about. Imperialist wars are about taking over resources, taking over markets. We have to be clear, and that's why the Democratic Party and the AFL-CIO leadership have nothing to do with working class interests. Workers in this country need to oppose this war because not only is it an attack on them, it's an attack on working people throughout the world. Now, we are also going to be supporting a rally for Julian Assange, who's another person who's put his life on the line to tell the truth about U.S. war crimes in Iraq. And have any of the people been prosecuted in Iraq who massacred these journalists that was exposed in WikiLeaks? No. But in any event, they want to extradite him to the United States. And on July 3rd, his birthday, we are going to be having a rally for him at Harry Bridges Plaza at 10:30 a.m., which is between the Ferry Building and Market Street. And what we're going to be saying at that rally, and Rescue Pacifica and others are supporting it, what we're going to say at that rally is that the wars which Julian Assange exposed actually are the reason he's being extradited, because he exposed the war crimes in the United States. And that's why they want to bring him back here. They want to kill him, actually. We have to unite the struggle against imperialist wars with the defense of Julian Assange, because that's what he is giving his life for. So we have to say, stop the war, stop U.S. intervention. We need workers' solidarity, and we need really a general strike in this country to shut down the war. That's the only thing the capitalists understand. And in Italy, there was a strike of FedEx workers, of Amazon workers against Italy supporting the war. And we need the same kind of action here. So if you're in a union, we need to organize and educate workers that we have to have a position against this war. The main enemy is at home. Turn the guns around. Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Thank you.
I think you did a really good job of laying out some of the basic underlying motivations for the wealthy and powerful in the U.S. to be pushing for further escalation of this war. And while I think many of us who have gathered here today have that clarity, a lot of our friends, family, neighbors, co-workers may not understand and may be lost in the jumble of all the rigmarole that's being put forth in the U.S. media today. So it's important to try to sit down and share some of these basic truths. Next up, we have Bert from DSA.
So first of all, solidarity with all the speakers. There's been a lot of important messages stated. I just wanted to start by saying this is something Cole Harrison of Mass Peace Action. They're doing an action today in Northampton at Jim McGovern's office, okay? He's another one of these Democrats that vote, well, I have to say, all I have to say is he's a Democrat, and then you know he voted for the damn war. So anyway, that's happening in Northampton today, and there was a headline in an article, Progressive Democrats don helmets, embrace U.S.-Russia proxy war. And one of the things he says in this article is, there is no voice for peace in Ukraine, okay, in Congress. Not a single voice among congressional Democrats for peace in Ukraine. That's the situation we're dealing with. That includes Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Barbara Lee, Mark Pocan, on and on and on and on. Every single one of them voted for this damn war, okay? And I had some conversation with Barbara Lee's legislative director and also her district coordinator, who's supposed to be in charge of this office. This office is shut down today. The building is shut down. I don't know how constituents are supposed to get access to their elected representatives. But anyway, we're here. We're going to march over a little later to along Harrison there by the lake so people see what we're out here for. So let's see. Why Barbara Lee? Well, you know, Barbara Lee has done some good things in the past, okay? She was the lone vote in Congress against the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11, which was the blank check that was used to authorize every U.S. military action for the last 20 years, most of which had nothing to do with the attack on the World Trade Center. So she stood up at that time and she said, okay, let me get my... She said, some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause, just for a minute, and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control. Okay, you know, you could take those words and apply them to this $40 billion that they just voted for. Talk about spiraling out of control, okay? I think World War III constitutes spiraling out of control. I think nuclear war constitutes spiraling out of control. I think continuing a war, this $40 billion is for 3 months worth of war. 3 months. Oh, we're going to come back in 2.5 months for another 40, 60, 80, $100 billion. Who the heck knows? And who the heck knows how much it's going to cost, not only in terms of American working people who are paying for this shit, but also at the expense of everything people need in this country. $20 billion, it's been estimated, could wipe out homelessness in this country. $20 billion, and now you're giving $40 billion. Now, a couple other statements by hers. There is no military solution to this crisis. This was a press release from Pramila Jayapal and Barbara Lee in late January. Then in March, after they voted for, at that time, $14 billion for the war, they said, the urgent need, and alongside this resolution, we must reaffirm the urgent need for diplomacy and de-escalation at this dangerous and unpredictable moment. Okay, support for diplomacy is the most direct means we have of trying to bring peace to Ukraine in light of continued fighting and mounting harm to Ukrainian civilians. We must work relentlessly toward de-escalation. I don't know about you, but I don't know of any politician in the Congress, anyone in the Congress, anyone in the Biden administration that's working relentlessly for de-escalation. I don't know of any of them that's working for peace. Not a single one of them. In fact, in addition to the billions of dollars that they're sending in weapons to Ukraine, they're also whipping up the rhetoric. They're calling Putin, Biden came out and said, God help us, Putin needs to go, something along those lines. And then afterwards they said, well, he didn't really mean that. It was just kind of a gaffe. Okay. His defense secretary met with, was in Ukraine and said that our goal is to weaken Russia. That's our goal, to weaken Russia. People remember the war in Afghanistan, right? When Russia invaded, okay? And U.S. armed the Mujahideen. They poured in a bunch of weapons. You might have seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War. True story. The goal was to weaken then the Soviet Union. So the neocons, and not only the neocons, but the Biden administration, this is the force for restraint. When I talked to Barbara Lee's legislative director, he said, oh, well, Biden is really being restrained, and he's staving off the real hawks. Well, I'm sorry. When you're president of the United States and calling for the overthrow of one of your main adversaries in the world, that is not de-escalating, okay? So, and what's the other? Nancy Pelosi, that's the other thing. Barbara Lee and Jim McGovern, guess what? They want a trip to Ukraine with Nancy Pelosi. And Nancy Pelosi says, we will stand behind the Ukrainian people until victory. Okay, what the hell does victory mean? What does victory mean? Does it mean 100,000 dead in Ukraine? Does it mean people starving in Africa and Asia because of by the way, the sanctions, and we oppose the sanctions just like we oppose sanctions against all adversaries of the U.S. As Aisha said, U.S. military intervention never does any good. Sanctions never do any good. It's economic warfare. Let me say, people talk about, Biden says, oh, the gas prices and the food, the inflation, it's all Putin's fault. Okay, as far as I know, the United States were the ones who started the economic warfare against Russia, who imposed the sanctions. They might as well taken a bullet to the head of the global economy, for Christ's sake. And the people who are bearing the brunt of it are people in Asia and Africa, where there's an incredible food crisis, and it's only getting worse. And even the New York Times talks about the American people will grow weary of sending all this money to Ukraine. Well, I don't know about you, but this war's been going on for, what is it now? Is it 3 months? 3 months? I'm already fucking weary of it. I'm weary of it. I'm weary of the U.S. trying to escalate this and use this as a way to pursue their aims to continue dominating the rest of the world. We have no interest in that. We have no interest in that. And I'll tell you something. Thanks for everyone showing up here today. People are going to turn against this bloody war. There's no question about it. You ask the American people, what's the main thing on your mind? Well, I'm worried about putting gas in my tank. I'm worried about feeding my kids. This is out of control. This is Biden. Biden did this. And every Democrat that stands behind Biden, Barbara Lee and company, did this. Okay? So let's be clear about that. One other thing is this is being framed as a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Democracy and autocracy. So there's a little bit of whataboutism here that needs to go on. When the U.S. talks about democracy, how can it be democracy when the Supreme Court, nine justices, well, that's an ironic term because the Supreme Court has nothing to do with justice, but 9 justices can take away women's right to choose if they decide they want to terminate their pregnancy and control over women's bodies. Is that democracy? When we have a Senate, which is a joke, they talk about the Senate as the oldest democratic deliberative body. Okay, the Senate. And you know where the Senate came from? It came from ancient Rome, where they were a slave society. Well, guess what? Our Senate started as a slave society also. And when people talk about the Founding Fathers and what they intended, I don't give a crap what they intended. They're all a bunch of slave owners and people who made money off of slavery. Why should we care what they intended? They intended to continue white supremacy forever. They intended to continue the domination of women forever. So when we talk about democracy, is the Senate democracy? Okay. When we talk about democracy, the Supreme Court justices, not only are they unelected, but they were nominated by presidents that lost the popular vote. Okay? They lost the popular vote. Is the Electoral College another relic of our Founding Fathers slaveholders? Is the Electoral College democracy? Okay, so when they talk about democracy against autocracy, one other point I want to make about democracy. How long? I got to wrap up. Okay, I'm going to wrap up real quick. Merrick Garland, okay, who's the Attorney General, exactly. What is he doing? He's not trying to protect a women's right to choose. He's not trying to protect the attempt of Trump and company to stay in power despite all the, quote, rules and laws governing how this process is supposed to work. He's in Ukraine. He's in Ukraine looking to prosecute Russians for war crimes. Well, look, if you want to prosecute people for war crimes, you don't have to start by going to Ukraine. You can start with George Bush. You can start with Dick Cheney. You can start with Bill Clinton. You can start with Barack Obama. You can start with Joe Biden. Those are our own homegrown war criminals. We don't have to go to Ukraine to process war criminals. And it's none of our business anyway. And this is only the beginning. Remember, this is only the beginning. We will win people over. We will oppose this war. We will stop this war. And we will turn out the politicians that are pushing it.
Bert had mentioned Barbara Lee's opposition to the Iraq war, and I think the reality is that Barbara Lee at the time was riding a wave of immense public outcry against the war, of tens of thousands of people marching in the streets of major U.S. cities around the country. And that's what it's going to take to build up that kind of response to this war. Next up, I'm going to call Rhonda from Bion, USA.
Can you repeat after me? Stop the U.S. war machine from Ukraine all the way to the Philippines. Stop the U.S. war machine from Ukraine all the way to the Philippines. Stop the U.S. war machine from Ukraine all the way to the Philippines. Thank you all for being here and having me up here. As our comrade said, I'm Rhonda Romero with Bayan USA. We're an alliance of 39 Filipino organizations across the country, and we're also part of the Resist US-Led War movement, which is a new network building across the world to fight against imperialist war. But you know what? I'm also a mother with 3 kids in the Oakland public schools here in this city. I'm also someone who's recovering from COVID, and I was actually supposed to be in Madrid right now protesting against the NATO Summit and US-led war in Ukraine, but I'm recovering from COVID, and I'm here on the streets in Oakland talking about, this actually $56 billion that have gone to the war in Ukraine, and yes, Barbara Lee has stood for that. I can think of so much more that pennies on the dollar of that $56 billion could go to right here in Oakland. I know about these schools that are being shut down. My kids don't want to go to schools that have 40 kids in the classroom. Have you ever tried to teach in a classroom of 3rd graders, 40 of them, understaffed, under-resourced, or have a kid in high school grappling with depression because of the way the COVID pandemic is being handled, and there are no fucking counselors there? I'm a pretty angry parent here in Oakland because of all this money that's getting siphoned off to this war in Ukraine. But not only that, it's been going to war profiteers for decades. We know that. And as someone from the movement for liberation of the Philippines, I know that billions of US dollars have been going to support repressive regimes around the world, including the one in my home country, and the one they're still supporting with billions of dollars every year to prop up a regime just because it's friendly to U.S. interests, to U.S. imperialist interests in the Asia Pacific, to in the so-called war against China and against the creeping, what do they call it, the new giant that's rising in the Asia Pacific. This is leading to all sorts of human rights violations, continued use and exploitation of my country. It's got to stop. So, to bring it back to the topic of this particular war in Ukraine and the $40 billion, $56 billion that's being sent over there. I want to say that we, Bayan USA, while we're standing for the liberation of our country, we stand in solidarity with people right here on the streets of Oakland, all of you here and others across the country and across the world, in condemning, this unlimited ATM, billions of dollars being sent over for the war in Ukraine. And also, we condemn this upcoming NATO Summit, which is happening in actually a day and a half in Madrid. Because, this just represents further militarization, further impoverishment of people of the world, further famine like has been talked about, just in order to protect U.S. interests in the world, to protect its allies' interests in the world, and to go into the coffers of the weapons corporations that are profiting with hundreds of billions of dollars in this war. Around the world, NATO states, and this includes especially the U.S. with its 800 to 1,000 bases around the world, maintain this intricate network of military bases and installations, including in those in the Philippines, from the UK to Saudi Arabia to the Philippines, which violate national sovereignty and cause environmental damage and social disruption. So, NATO, preeminent military arm of the U.S., it continues to destabilize foreign countries and prop up reactionary and fascistic governments across Europe, so including in Poland, including in Ukraine, including in Turkey, including Hungary. NATO gives unwavering support to Palestine, as our comrade said earlier. And the NATO member Turkey has initiated military aggression in North and East Syria, South Kurdistan, in a brutal war to eliminate the Kurdish people. NATO members continue to lead Operation Ocean Shield that harassed and displaced fisherfolk communities in Somalia, assisting African Union forces in cracking down on people's movements in Sudan and Burundi. So this is worldwide. This prolonged armed conflict today in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, can really be traced back to NATO's very beginnings. Its very founding in 1949 explicitly was there to surround and contain Russia. They made no bones about it. They were very clear. This has led now, decades later, to NATO's military buildup in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, including US bases and the use of NATO country bases in Greece and Cyprus, dozens of annual military exercises involving tens of thousands of forces and nuclear-armed ships in the Mediterranean, Arctic, and European countries surrounding Russia, and the recruitment of former Soviet republics neighboring Russia into the alliance since 1999. The whole Russian military entry into Ukraine, it was preceded by a series of provocative and aggressive actions by US-led NATO forces and deadly attacks against the independent Donbas republics. This included the sale and transfer of weapons to Ukraine, so billions of dollars, again, going from the US into Ukraine, large-scale air exercises, flying aircraft over Russia's borders, sending the UK Navy's air defense destroyers, statements about strengthening NATO's flank in Romania and Bulgaria, and then last but not least, open invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. Ukraine right there on the border of Russia to join NATO. NATO, and especially the US, continue to stoke these fires with a continuous export of arms to Ukraine, as we were just talking about here. I can think of so many more things that could be bought with just a fraction of this $56 billion here in Oakland. So who here would rather spend that money to keep public schools in Oakland open? Anyone here? Yeah. Who here would rather spend that money to provide free quality health care for everyone who needs it? Anyone here? Would anyone here rather spend that money on sheltering unhoused people who are exposed to this record-breaking heat here in Oakland? All right, good. So, instead, the US and NATO are spending billions and calling for more billions to fund war and militarism. In fact, they're continuing to demand larger military budgets and greater military spending from each of the member states. So here in the US, we know, $780 billion every year on defense, so-called defense spending, or for the Department of War, as we should really call it. Well, they're even trying to pressure NATO countries to spend more of their money on the military, as if the 2% or 1.5% of these other states' budgets aren't enough. And then, just this recently, last week, the newly elected, or I don't know what to call him, French President Macron in France just said that France is going to be adopting a war economy. So, everybody is falling in line with the whole U.S. rhetoric, and the U.S. is really capitalizing on the war in Ukraine to continue to push its agenda with the countries that are in NATO. But really, I just want to say and end with, everybody around the world, people really reject NATO as this tool of U.S.-led war, and I know people here are standing with that too. NATO and its proponents will never achieve real peace and security for the masses of the world. It's really only the people, it's us, right? Standing together, taking to the streets, doing the general strikes, as Steve said. That is what's going to attain a genuine, just peace. We have to do this by organizing for justice and social equity, by forging solidarity amongst peoples, including the recognition of the right to self-determination, economic and food sovereignty, self-defense of nations and oppressed peoples from reactionary violence, including U.S. and NATO-led aggression. People's movements are already forging this path by fighting to close NATO bases, opposing joint military exercises, and causing disruptions in cities, hosting NATO meetings, and much more. As the heads of NATO gather for their summit in Madrid, it's nice to see us here in Oakland and people all over the world taking to the streets to demand the dismantling of NATO, an end to imperialist wars, and the removal of all foreign troops. That includes U.S. troops, especially occupying countries without the consent of the people. We pledge to build a movement that fights for a just and lasting peace in order to end all wars of aggression, defend self-determination, and free the people. Dismantle NATO, end imperialist wars, free the people, and long live international solidarity.
Thank you, Rhonda, for that really comprehensive and detailed overview of this ongoing narrative of NATO expansion that's been happening really since the founding of the treaty organization in 1949. Since then, the number of countries who are part of NATO has more than doubled. And I think There are many people in this country who are only now learning about the nature of the conflict in Eastern Europe and really buying the excuse my language, bullshit narrative that this is just about Putin, the crazy psycho who decided to all of a sudden invade Ukraine for no reason. And we have to be able to break it down like Rhonda just did and say, no, there's actually been years, decades of political, economic conflict that has led up to this point here today. I want to bring up John from Vets for Peace East Bay chapter.
I want to especially thank Katie and Bert, who I think have put more into this than anybody else and made this possible. So for them and all the others who worked very hard on this, a little applause. Thank you very much. So there are two words that are music to my ears, which I'm hearing over, I better take this off, which I'm hearing over and over again today. And those two words are proxy war. This is not a war. If this were a war between Russia and Ukraine, then we would have no business there. If this is a war for democracy, then tell the people of Palestine that the United States stands for democracy, not oppressive apartheid. If this is a war to protect sovereignty of nations, then tell that to the Iraqi people, tell that to the people of Afghanistan, tell that to the people of Vietnam. None of those things are what's going on here. This is a proxy war of the United States to bring down one of its major adversaries in the world, which is Russia. And we should be very clear on that. The United States is not just another garden variety imperialist power. The United States has set as its goal since just before World War II in 1941 to be the dominant force on the planet. Its latest expression is the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which says any country that dares to become regionally as powerful as we are shall be put down. If we have to impoverish them, if we have to break them up, if we have to wage endless war on them, if we have to impose sanctions on them, we will do it. If we have to take China and re-impoverish 1.4 billion people so that they're not number one, we will do it. That is our policy. It's stated over and over again. You can read the book, Tomorrow the World. It's all laid out there. So this is a proxy war. And I heard someone say just a few moments ago that the war began in February 2022. This war did not begin in February 2022. This war began in 2014 when, under pressure from the United States, the Ukrainians started shelling the Donbass and killing thousands of people all year after year. Nobody said anything about that. I read today a little piece by Noam Chomsky, who's usually very good, but he said, Putin never tried diplomacy. Putin has been begging since 2015 to stop the shelling of the Donbass. Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany put together the Minsk agreements, which said, stop this, let's have a ceasefire. The United States said, nothing doing, Zelensky, you're going to continue to fight. And that's what has happened, and that's what has led us to this pass. Everybody in the know knew that the march of NATO eastward and these manipulations in Ukraine would lead to a war with Russia. Nobody had any doubts about that. We pressed on because we wanted it. I would say one more thing about this war that's been brought out. This war, I would say, had a surprise to it, because when the sanctions against Russia were imposed, China refused. But surprise, India refused. Most of the global south, the majority, by far the majority of the world's population said, no, we are not going to participate in these sanctions. It is not Russia that's isolated. It is the United States which is isolated. If you look at the people of color around the world and not just the imperialist powers of Europe. So I would say what we're witnessing here in Ukraine is the first major battle of the global South against the U.S., against the drive of U.S. for hegemony. And each one of us is going to decide, are we on the side of the global South? Are we on the side of people who are struggling for development and freedom? Or are we on the side of the U.S. empire? Each one of us will have to decide, because this struggle will go on, because the peoples of the world, the peoples of the global South, do not want to live the way they have had to live for so long. Thank you very much.
I want to bring up Miles from the United Front Against Displacement, who's been involved in housing organizing in the Bay Area. He'll speak a little bit about the connection between this war and the situation in public and subsidized and low-income housing across the U.S. So,
Barbara Lee, like many other politicians, argues that this war is against Russian aggression. This is a common conception in the United States. The United States is aiding in the defense of Ukraine. But this position completely ignores NATO and the United States government's fault in beginning this war. How can we claim to be defending a country from a war we helped start? There are numerous signs that Russia saw NATO expansion as an existential threat. Angela Merkel said herself recently that she knew Russia would see NATO expansion in Ukraine as a declaration of war. Yet we pushed forward. In 2008, U.S. Ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, wrote the Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice saying much the same thing, that if Ukraine joined NATO, NATO would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Russian-Ukrainian relations go into a deep freeze, and it will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and Ukraine. This was all also before Russia invaded Georgia in 2014 for the same threat of NATO expansion. So we have plenty of warning signs, but they were ignored. And instead, the U.S. continued to play political games to bring Ukraine into NATO, gambling with the lives of Ukrainian citizens. Our involvement in both the Orange Revolution and the 2014 Euromaidan protests speak to this. Both instances put pro-NATO and pro-EU presidents in office and removed pro-Russian President Yanukovych. Both instances had heavy U.S. involvement. A transcript between U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and a U.S. diplomat in Ukraine in 2014 showed that the U.S. was trying to organize the political opposition in Ukraine to their own political motives, deciding who would and would not be a fit to lead the country. So the U.S. and NATO had deep knowledge of the provocation for war that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be, and continuously manipulated Ukrainian politics to make sure this would be the government's position. And now, as war displaces millions in Ukraine and tears the country apart, we are continuing this war effort by funneling billions of dollars into a war we began. Billions of dollars going to war profiteers, while institutions like public housing fall apart for lack of funding. There is no lack of funding for public housing, though, but simply a lack of profit for American corporations. This is what drives our war machine, and this is what is driving the sale of public housing. So while the rich get richer across the world, the oppressed are beaten down further and robbed of what little we have. Thank you.
So we have Laurel, Marcia, and Dawn.
Okay, what I want to talk about is, what I was going to say is that I ran against Barbara Lee in 2018, and that's when you really learn what somebody's about. And she sets the upper limit of what people can express because she's like the most progressive. Also, Latin America, I went to the Workers' Summit a week ago or so, and Latin America is an example for us, I believe, strongly to learn from. What happened was that Biden called a summit of the Americas and left out 3 nations, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And the people in Los Angeles created a People's Summit of the Americas. And the U.S. refused to allow Cubans to enter the country. So the people of Latin America created a workers' summit in Tijuana at about the same time, and the Cubans were there, Venezuelans were there, Nicaraguans. I was lucky enough to be there. And that is the kind of solidarity among nations that people, they don't all agree with each other. Some of them are a little bit more this way and some of them are a little bit more that way. But they stood together, like Mexico said, you're not bringing our brother and sister nations, we're not coming. And so I just want to say that that's something we can learn. And a little bit we learned, and I think I'm still within 2 minutes, is that we had a left unity slate for the June primary here in California, where the Green Party and the Peace and Freedom Party worked together. We had a slate, we didn't compete, and we're expecting more and more of that to happen. So I say, yay, solidarity! Yay, solidarity! Wherever you can be in solidarity and in support of somebody, even if you disagree with some of the stuff they say, let's do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. We have to be able to work through our disagreements. And Marcia Fineland is up from the Peace and Freedom Party.
So I'll be really brief. Peace and Freedom Party has been on the ballot since 1967. One thing that we agree on about this war is that it should not be happening. End to all wars and end to and to NATO. So there's a song that goes, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Well, unfortunately, it is good for some people. It's good for the war makers. It's good for the war machine. It's good for the weapons manufacturers. It's good for the imperialist powers. It not only keeps them wealthy, but it keeps the working class of the world divided. And what we need is unity. What we need is no war, but the class war.
I'm going to welcome up Don Borgstrom from KPFA, Local Station Board, and Rescue Pacifica. Welcome up, Don.
I'm Daniel Borgstrom. I'm on the board at KPFA. Been on the board about 4 years now. Let me ask you real quickly, how many of you listen to KPFA? Show of hands, please.
With morbid interest.
Only about a third. Let me talk about what KPFA, the role that KPFA should be playing in this, is playing in this, and hopefully will be playing in this. KPFA went on the air back in 1949, and it opposed the war in Korea. It stood up to the McCarthy investigation. KPFA was opposed the war in Vietnam and so forth. And I'd like to say that KPFA is opposing this war. Well, actually, KPFA has slipped. Now, is slipping. And I'm encouraging all of you to listen to KPFA. We have many good programs and some pretty bad ones. We had some good ones that got kicked off. Steve Zeltzer right here, he was on KPFA. He had a program, Workweek Radio. They kicked him off. And we got to get people like him back on. And I'm in a group, in an affinity group called Rescue Pacifica. We are a minority on the board. Our program includes a number of things, keeping KPFA Pacifica together, and also definitely maintaining KPFA's anti-war voice, anti-imperialism. Now, if you listen to KPFA, to some programs on KPFA, you'll hear friendly words for humanitarian imperialism. Now, let me say another thing. I've been on the board about 4 years. I was also 4 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. People ask me sometimes why I joined the Marine Corps, because there was no other voice out there. Well, KPFA can play that voice, and I'm afraid that some of those programs that are on there today, if I were to hear them, a little teenage Daniel, myself, I might think, hey, maybe I should join the Marine Corps and defend democracy against those awful Russians. I might get the impression from today that is what we are. That is what we're standing up against. So, let me once again, KPFA 94.1. Please listen to it. Some of our programs are very good. Also, become a member. Become a voting member. We do have elections. That's how I got on the board, because I was elected to it. And okay, so that's all I have to say. Please become members of KPFA and support our group, Rescue Pacifica.
We have our last speaker on the list, Ricardo Ortiz.
Hello, everybody. I'm a member of United Public Workers for Action, and I'm originally from Puerto Rico, founding member of the Frente Socialista, and I'm a veteran of the United States Army too. So, being from Puerto Rico, we had a lot of struggles against the American armed forces. We were able to expel the Navy in 2003 out of the island of Vieques. We shut them down, we defeated them. Thanks for the struggle that our people made and support like people like you, particularly from the ILW Local 10. And I want a big applause for Jack Heyman, who introduced a resolution in the ILW demanding the Navy out of Vieques and free all Puerto Rican political prisoners. Now, let's talk about a few things right here. During the Cold War, obviously the objective of the United States imperialists and its allies, the social democratic governments of Europe too, were complices of the Cold War drive against the Soviet Union and the Eastern European deformed worker states, and Cuba too. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, immediately the United States went into Eastern Europe, particularly in this specific case in Ukraine, and then sent an envoy called Natalie Jaresko, which was a State Department official with a task force of people from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, the Agency for International Development, and the European Bank of Reconstruction. And you know what they did? They started privatizing the Ukrainian economy, making capitalist, imperialist investments in Ukraine. They actually went so far to create an Ukrainian-American Chamber of Commerce and a German-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, which were the front of companies like BMW and many American banking institutions. Right there, the World Bank and the IMF made the Ukraine to get loans to privatize the economy. On behalf of the person that was directing this was this State Department official that I just mentioned. In the 2014 counter-revolution, the United States forced the Ukrainian government to appoint an Ukrainian American as the finance minister of the Ukraine. Her name, you know who it was? Natalie Jaresko, the same Ukrainian American born in Chicago and raised over there to oversee loans and more privatization. This is how you deal and understand this thing. And during her tenure, she also and her family were the owners of Horizon Bonds, which is a company that she directed that was able to gain more than 400 million on the backs of the Ukrainian people. That is called neoliberalism. That is called economic imperialist intervention. And even before the 2000 coup, already the United States and particularly Germany, they were training and equipping their armed forces of the Ukraine because they wanted to penetrate those markets and make the Ukraine, which effectively was and is a neo-colony of the United States and Europe. That's what they are, all in collaboration intervening in Ukraine. Those are the reasons. I just want to say a couple of things before I finish right here. All this economic penetration and pillage of Ukraine started in 1993 under the Democratic Party, none other than Bill Clinton. The same Bill Clinton that signed into effect NAFTA. The same Bill Clinton that signed into effect the Immigration Reform Act that the people are being kicked out of this country, undocumented workers. That same criminal that signed into law the effective death penalty of 1996 under the Democratic Party. So this is not an accident. The Democratic Party is the oldest capitalist party in the world. Think about that. It's not an accident that Barbara Lee would make a mistake right here and there. She represents ultimately the interests of the capitalist class. That's why one day she would do something good, but then with the other hand, she would vote for the capitalist class. And we have to make that clear to people. These are not accidents. These are not accidents. Who was the party that ruled over most of the Vietnam War? It was the Democratic Party. World War II, the Democratic Party. World War I, the Democratic Party. Actually, before America got into the First World War in 1917, it had invaded Haiti in 1915, the Dominican Republic in 1916, Mexico in 1917, under the presidency of a Democratic Party president that loved privately to see in the White House the death of a nation, a movie that glorified the KKK. That's the Democratic Party for you. So it's useless supporting the Democrats. We should strive for building a revolutionary workers' party that will bring down the capitalist system and will make it possible, the possibility of imperialist war. And I just want to say something. Unfortunately, the person that spoke before me left. In Latin America, it's nothing revolutionary that is happening right now. Actually, what is happening is that these reformist governments that are being elected, they are running with a capitalist reformist platform. It's nothing spoken about the possibility of constructing worker states. You know, that Gustavo Petro that won in Colombia is gonna, supposedly a progressive, he says nothing about the US military bases in there. Why? Because it's going to govern under the capitalist government platform. So we have to build revolutionary workers' parties in Latin America. That's the only way that we can kick the Yankee imperialists and his allies out of the continent. I just want to finish with one thing too. People have forgotten to say something. It's a country right here in the hemisphere, besieged, surrendered, and blockaded, and it's a worker state, and that is Cuba. And that is Cuba. We have to strive to end the blockade, stop the blockade against Cuba. And right here in the belly of the beast, we have to build a revolutionary workers' party. No reformism. The Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, the Bernie Sanders that supported and voted for the building of the F-35 super fighter bomber does not represent us. They do not represent us. Ocasio-Cortez is a sellout. She said that she supports the foreign policy of this country. She said that she would obey the leadership of the Democratic Party. And what the Democratic Party is doing? Obviously, you see right now, getting into war, putting us in dangers of a world war. So these phonies that even as sometimes now are calling themselves socialists, they are not real socialists. They are social democrats. And social democracy from the get-go. They killed Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, because those were revolutionaries. Those were trying to build independent workers' parties. So those are I redeem the memory of Luxemburg, of Liebknecht, of Marx, Engels, Trotsky. And I say, for revolution, let's be the workers' party. Down with capitalism, toward a world without frontiers.
2, 3, 4, we don't want the Ukraine war.
5, 6, 7, 8, Biden, do not escalate.
5, 6, 7, 8, Biden, do not escalate.